I'm Kevin Schultz. I am a professor of history and religious studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I'm currently chair of the Department of History there.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about your fairly new book, Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, including white liberals. So, could you explain to us, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the book, how you came to be interested in the topic and why you chose the word liberal to kind of unpack recent American history?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I didn't choose the word liberal, but history chose the word liberal as far as this topic goes, which isn't to dismiss your question. It's a real serious and interesting question. So the book came about because it was sort of the perfect intersection of what I was seeing going on in American life, which is the extreme polarization of American political life, which has only gotten increasingly worse as this book was drafted and written and published and is now out for a couple weeks. And so I was watching the polarization of our politics. And then I saw how it sort of had seeped into not just politics, but it had seeped into the neighborhoods that we choose to live in, even the kind of jobs that we choose to go into. My favorite story was on dating apps where you could say that you're not interested in dating a Democrat or you're not interested in dating a Republican. So this polarization of extremely, mostly talking to people on either the left or the right had really influenced more than just politics, but was this really dramatic component of American life, a really important component of American life for lots and lots of people. And on the one hand, I thought this was kind of unfortunate because if you look at Americans' beliefs on issues, it actually looks sort of like a bell curve where we actually do have a strong middle of a bell curve where most Americans generally agree on some sort of topic, whatever that topic may be. But if it's an issue, there's large scale agreement. But what we were hearing on social media, in newspapers, in the press, from politicians was the sort of extreme ends, the polarized ends of the bell curve. So you got this fat middle and you got these polarized ends, and that's where all the amplification was coming from. So I was sort of worried about this and what it means for the fate of American democracy. I don't think I'm alone right now in having that fear, or at least that quandary. And I realized, holy moly, I'm a history professor who's written several history books. And my previous books had all sort of told the story of the construction of this notion in the middle decades of the 20th century that we all Americans anyway, sort of had a common purpose. And there was a lot of common ground. And there was a centrist philosophy of life that most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, agreed on. And it was called liberalism. They called it liberalism, not me. And so I was very curious. My first book was about how Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, it was called Tri-Faith America, Protestants, Catholic, and Jews coming up with the three faiths of tri-faith, and how they put forward this image of the United States in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s that countered the predominant image, which was back when there was huge income inequality, when the robber barons were running rampant in the 1910s and 20s. And immigration was imagined to be this sort of cancer in American society. And there were these hooded and masked vigilantes out there trying to enforce order. Of course, today that's ICE, but back then it was a group called the Ku Klux Klan, still the largest single social movement in American history. And to counter this vision of sort of a white Christian nationalist image that the Klan was putting forward in the 1910s and 1920s were my, handful of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And they were putting forward this image that we were a nation of immigrants, that we were a pluralistic place, that tolerance had to be the sort of base rudimentary component by which we all could get along. And that image took hold in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, sort of won. It became the predominant image of the United States that presidents embraced, from a Democrat like Franklin D. Roosevelt all the way to, Republicans like Dwight Eisenhower. And you could even make a case that someone like Richard Nixon even embraced large components of this sort of liberal notion of what it meant to be American, and to which many, many, many Americans subscribe. And then my second book was about sort of the 1960s, the 1970s, this moment where that sort of cohesive organization that was called liberalism started to come apart. So I took my sort of current political interest in watching and being afraid and being nervous about the polarization of American life, and I traced it to my historical knowledge. Why not use the knowledge that we already have in our brains and say, okay, what happened and what was this called in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s? And I discovered I sort of knew, but I actually the hypothesis was proven correct, that they called this notion liberalism. Now, one of the great finds for me of the book, I was surprised, is that the word liberal, if you study it today, you trace it back to Rousseau and Locke and Thomas Paine and all of these philosophers from the 17th and 18th centuries. But the word liberal did not have a history in the United States. Really, it had a small history. It popped up here, it popped up there. But it wasn't until the summer of 1932. Oh my gosh, John, I was so excited. I found the exact speech where Franklin Roosevelt, he's trying to come up with a way to name this system that he's proposing. You and I, it's the depths of the Great Depression, and you and I know it today as the New Deal, when he was going to take all the cards back and give everybody a new deal. But it was called liberalism, and he was being accused of being a communist, being accused of being a socialist. And so he's searching for a word, looking for a phrase that would actually encapsulate this sort of centrist belief. And he stumbled upon liberalism. The crowd cheered in the speech that he went. He gave another speech and he used it 3 times. And before the end of summer, he was calling his vision the liberal vision for America. He never used the word liberal in his life, at least in any of the political speeches before then. So from 1932 on, the liberal vision for America defined the centrist tradition between communism on the left and authoritarian fascism on the right. And good old Americanism was liberal centrist American, where we're going to have capitalism, but we're going to put up some government mandated enforcements and buttresses and regulations to prevent it from its worst problematic sort of exigencies. And then we're also not going to go obviously all the way towards a communist or even a dramatically socialist state, depending on how you want to define socialism. So this was the agreement. And most Americans throughout the middle decades of the 20th century sort of bought into it. And I have all the polling data that shows, about half of Americans consider themselves liberals, and about another quarter on top of that were friendly with liberals and thought liberalism was a good thing. So it was only these sort of very marginal sides on the far left and the far right who were really opposing liberalism. So that's sort of what got me into the book. I was sort of excited to see this moment when we were all together and how that came about. What were the rhetorical tools that the presidents and that the politicians and that the journalists were using to construct this sense of notion that the Americans were all, part of a single commonweal. And it made sense for us to pay taxes because those taxes would be useful in building roads and building public schools and building hospitals and making this sort of American society a much more fruitful, generous place. The public universities were sort of the big mantle of the 1940s and 50s. They grew tremendously after World War II. Why did they do that? Well, in part because of the GI Bill, the federal government paying for the World War II soldiers to get their higher education. And then also federal government was subsidizing a lot of this growth. And in return, those people were our aerospace engineers who were funding the space race. They were coming up with all sorts of new scientific breakthroughs to end diseases that had plagued the country for 200 plus years. So there was sort of this give and take that the state in this liberal order was going to provide money and provide support, and then the citizens were going to contribute and pay that back. And that was sort of the centrist notion that held sway for a long time in American history.
Well, thank you for the beginnings of the word, and I think too that I would like you to, because I know when Roosevelt proposed the word and the New Deal was not universally accepted, there were people on both sides, the right and the left, who either thought he went too far or didn't go far enough. And I think that that is the story of the word, correct? And the concept, like there are these organized polls that are kind of like, what are we doing with this middle? So could you briefly talk about the kind of the opposition to the New Deal on both those fronts, but then more importantly, what happens after the war? Because I think that's when we start to get the complicated history of some of the organizational movements to really create something out of liberal that wasn't really there before, right? I mean, we didn't really have this notion of an other ideology that could be lionized by everybody.
Yeah, it's a great question. And to answer it, I got to give a little capsule history of the word liberal just before it has an American history, really, because it's really important to understand that liberal and liberalism has never really been defined by a strict set of narrow policies, but instead is defined by a spirit that it comes from the Latin word liber or liber, which means free. So how can individuals have freedom in opposition to the thing that is trying to oppose it? So the word dates back to Shakespeare's time, and in Shakespeare's era, it signified sort of a generosity of spirit or financial generosity, and also sort of having a more expansive interest in what you could do with your life. So most of us today would see a remnant of this in what is called a liberal arts education. It used to be you got a vocational education, which meant you were trained for a strict career. And then liberal arts comes along where they argue that there is some merits to learning philosophy and literature and politics and a vast sort of expanse of the human condition. After that, the word really took on a more combative notion, liberal and liberalism, to oppose anything that was really trying to restrict the power or the freedom of an individual. Of course, it goes back to the root word of liber. And so in the 16th and 17th century, the power holders were churches, usually the Catholic Church, most especially in Europe. And so liberals in the European sense back then signified advocacy for religious tolerance and religious freedom and not having religious mandates on who could serve in the political order, who could make laws. So it was sort of opposing any restrictive religious laws in the 16th and 17th century. Moving forward to the 18th century, you get sort of the period of the American founding, which is who's restricting the freedoms, who's restricting individual liberals? It's kings and queens, right? So all of a sudden the liberals become those who believe in political rights for the individual and the sense that individuals should have a say in who governs them and should have an ability to overturn or push laws that affect their daily life. And so this is when you see the American Revolution. This is when you see the French Revolution. This is when some of the first liberal parties pop up in Europe, not in the United States, importantly for the story that I get to tell. And then also within this framework, these liberals of the 18th and 19th century who put in motion all these political freedoms, they also saw sort of free market capitalism and sort of a small business capitalism as a kind of way to restrict royal monopolies. Sort of the tea companies saying you have to buy our tea kind of stuff. No, individuals should be able to buy whatever kind of tea they want. And if somebody wants to start their own tea company, they should be allowed to do that. So the word liberal got associated with free market capitalism. So coming into the 20th century and finally getting to your question here, liberalism had these two sort of sensibilities. One was how it had the sensibilities in a political sense. It always had this philosophical foundation of how can we expand and ensure individual freedoms. But the political sensibilities were free market capitalism and then also this political notion of rights and responsibilities of citizens. So today in Europe, a lot of the liberal parties, they're still called that to this day, they hold on to that 19th century vision for the most part, and they are sort of free market, center-right parties. In the United States, though, because we didn't have that 19th century tradition of liberal parties, our tradition only starts with FDR in 1932, and that speech that I found in the summer of 1932, I was so excited to find that. And what that tradition is, a shift. So who in the 1930s, and even before then you can make an argument, is the power holder? Who are the people that are restricting individuals' freedoms? Well, the answer is no longer religious monopolies. It's no longer monarchs, but it is, to use the word of Bernie Sanders, oligarchs. It's big businessmen. It's the robber barons who are so wealthy and they're so powerful that they can control like puppets the senators and the congressmen that are making laws. And so liberalism in the 1930s comes to be defined as promoting the use of government to push back against the power of big business so that there can be a basic floor of equality from which Americans can then go on to achieve great things. The state had a responsibility to provide opportunities for citizens. Otherwise, those opportunities would be restricted by the oligarchs. So that was the state's responsibility. And that's where liberal came about to have its current meaning in some ways today. This was so wildly popular, so unbelievably popular, that like I mentioned earlier, both Democrats and Republicans embraced what was called the liberal order. And it meant that some people grew a little bit frustrated. And this gets to your question of some of this pushback against the liberal order. even though this sort of high point of liberalism was generally wildly successful in what its aims were. I mean, in the 1940s and 1950s, we had the fattest middle class than we've ever had in American history. We had extreme wealth inequalities in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, starting in the 1930s with the New Deal, going on into the 1940s and into the 1950s, when the government is really trying to raise all boats, to use John F. Kennedy's metaphor. We have the fattest middle class that we'd ever had in our history and that we had ever had since then, because it starts to go away in the 1970s. So these mid-century liberals did provide this fat middle class. They expanded suburbs, they expanded public education. We'll get to this, I know, in a little bit, but they also pushed for civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Housing Rights Act of 1968. These are all sort of accomplishments of mid-century liberalism. But despite these accomplishments, there are all these political actors on the left and the right and from civil rights activists who either hate liberalism and what it's trying to do, or they are opposed to sort of its inability to go far enough and bring about, say, true equality for Black people or true economic equality from people on the left. So starting in the 1950s and 1960s, you start to see this opposition to liberals and liberalism. And it comes from multiple quarters at the same time. And what's interesting, and this really gets to the question, is all of these people have a different understanding of what a liberal is. And so they define liberals and liberalisms so differently that no, self-respecting liberal would claim to own up to what it is that they're saying.
Well, let's talk about that process a little bit, because I found it fascinating, because I think that non-definition is so important to not only your thesis, but also kind of where we are today, because it seems to be this catch-all for everything we don't like. So I think we should probably start with William F. Buckley Jr. and just kind of, who was he? What did he do? And he was wildly successful at his project, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I spend a lot of time detailing sort of the three principal lines of opposition to the liberal order of the middle of the 20th century. And one of those lines of opposition comes from the right, and it is centered on William F. Buckley Jr. I mean, I wrote a whole book on this guy, so I know a lot about William F. Buckley Jr. But what I'll say here for listeners today is that he is considered the patron saint of modern conservatism. Before him, in the 1930s and 1940s, there was no real self-respecting conservative movement in the United States. There were conservatives, but they were sort of hampered by open anti-Semitism or open bigotry, racial bigotry. And so there was, nobody really wanted to touch the conservative movement that wanted to have a national story in American political life. So William F. Buckley comes along in the 40s and especially in the 1950s. He starts his principal magazine, National Review, in 1955, which is still a sounding voice on the right. He also goes on television in Firing Line TV series on PBS, which is one of the longest airing television shows where he brings on political debate and political conversation. And his argument, quite simply, is not necessarily to build up a coherent conservatism, because the conservative movement has so many factions that oppose each other. You get people who are small government conservatives who want, libertarian principles to be enforced. You get people who want greater Christianity in public life, which means the government has to take a bigger role and play a bigger part in Americans' life. So they don't necessarily agree on these two things. But what William F. Buckley does is say, hey, let's all come together, everybody, under this big tent, this big umbrella, and our party will move forward in opposition to liberalism. So in 1959, he writes what is still, well, he's dead now, but what was his sort of magnum opus of the conservative movement. And he wanted to initially call it, I Smell the Blood of a Liberal, but some people pushed back on that as the title. So he called it Up from Liberalism. And the point is, I mean, he was stealing Booker T. Washington's sort of biographical title, which was Up from Slavery. So he was making this comparison that 20th century liberalism, despite all the accomplishments that I just rattled off, was parallel to 19th century chattel slavery. and it was going to enslave us. And the liberals didn't know it, but they were going to bring about socialism and bring about communism, and they were actually going to end up restricting our freedoms. And so this line of thinking from the right that William F. Buckley pioneered in the 1950s and 1960s is still with us today. I mean, you still see Donald Trump tweeting about the socialist commie liberals who are out to steal everything, and Zoran Mamdani is a communist, all these kinds of things. So this is still like a standard attack that we get from the right, but it was pioneered 75 years ago, so it's been around for a long time.
And then we see too that, once Buckley kind of lays out this strategy of, we're going to just have this kind of shell of an argument, of a bad guy, people start dumping things into it. And some of the people who start dumping into it are Spiro Agnew. We have Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare, and tying it to anything that is fearful and anger inducing. So this fear and anger become very much part of what gets dumped into what a leftist liberal is. So briefly, could you explain how the danger is really amped up by these other figures once Buckley kind of lays it out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you picked up on that point, because Buckley sort of lays the foundation that liberals are anti-Christian and they are anti-capitalist. That's his argument, right? The two C's. And from there, that remains the foundation, and we still hear echoes of that today. But in addition, as you were saying, there are all these layers, especially from the right, that makes liberals not only anti-Christian and anti-capitalist, but also they are sort of overly sympathetic to civil rights activists. And today we would call that woke. They're these woke agenda who are pushing DEI down our throats when it far outpaces what most Americans want. Not only are they that, but they're also sort of elitist. We've heard of the elite liberals who are sort of pushing on us things that they don't necessarily have to suffer the consequences of. One of my favorite stories of this elitist example comes in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when a guy named John V. Lindsay was running for mayor of New York City. And he was 6'5" and had a beautiful head of hair and was a good looking guy and also a ton of money. And he would show up in his limousine to Harlem and give a speech about the plight of Black America and how, good American, white Americans needed to do something to relieve the burden of Black people. And then he would take his limousine to the public schools and give a speech on how public schools were the bedrock of America. And then he would take his limousine to go pick up his kids from private schools because they were, so wealthy that they could afford to send their kids to private schools. So his political opponent at the time, interestingly enough, was sort of a law and order Democrat, but he called him a limousine liberal, which I love. It's a phrase that stuck. So these liberals are not only anti-capitalism and also anti-Christian, but they're elite snobs who think they're better than we are and who are woke warriors who are pushing this kind of agenda down our throats where they're not going to be the ones who suffer the consequences. And you could see this today, just turn on any right-wing television show, read a Laura Ingraham book or speech, look at Dinesh D'Souza. All of these sort of notion isn't necessarily putting forward a positive vision for what conservatism is. That's not the game, right? But the game is to punish the enemy. And who are the enemies? It's the white liberals that have created this notion that we are struggling up against. And you're right. The phrase liberal and who a liberal is morphed and became this sort of amoebic component that whoever our enemy is, whoever's burdening our life, well, they're the liberals.
Yeah, so we've kind of covered the right, and I would love to begin with, and I know that we have Norman Mailer and Sal Alinsky and some really heavy, in their mind, heavy hitters. But I think I really want to just focus on Tom Wolfe, because I think what Tom Wolfe does is, at one point, like brilliant satire and also incredible disservice. So if you could explain what happens to Tom Wolfe and Leonard Bernstein and kind of the Black Panthers and how that really defines the left's attack on liberal, because it does the similar things but differently.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And The article that Tom Wolfe called, which is "Radical Chic," is how we know it, came in New York Magazine in 1970. It's a masterful, hilarious article. I mean, I was writing and I was laughing as I was reading and writing this article, and it talks about the appetizers at this fancy Upper East Side political meeting or rally or party, depending on what you want to call it, how you want to think about it, that was trying to raise money for some of the Black Panthers who had been arrested. So they were trying to raise legal defense funds for the Black Panthers. So, I mean, what a great mock. But before I get to that, let me back up just a minute, because you mentioned Saul Alinsky and Norman Mailer. And for one second, I just want to put forward what the general foundational critique was from the left, and then we'll get to Tom Wolfe. So it's sort of in the same way that William F. Buckley provided this foundation, and then Laura Ingraham and Dinesh D'Souza and all these other people on the right have taken that and morphed it. So on the left, the foundation is liberals might be doing all of these kinds of things, broadening the middle class, opening up ways for Black equality, but they're not really doing enough to bring about radical possibilities. And especially in the Red Scare of the 1950s, they were so afraid of communism that they were so in bed with capitalism. So the liberal order was mostly just shoring up capitalism and preventing it from its worst abuses, instead of truly bringing about and embracing more socialism. I mean, one thing that we hear about today, and maybe it'll help for our listeners to understand, is after World War II, most industrialized nations in Western Europe get a nationalized healthcare system. And the United States does not, because we're so afraid of socialized medicine and what that will look like, and will it bring about a communist revolution? And so instead, we now get our health insurance, most of us, from our employers. So therefore, we are afraid of quitting our jobs and pursuing our dreams because we need to have health insurance. So the people on the left say, hey, we're not really embracing a leftist ideology. All we are is endorsing capitalism. And look, I mean, on the left, we're building suburbs. You know, we're expanding outward. We're not imagining radical possibilities for urban living. And in the suburbs, of course, this is when the great critiques of the 1950s conformity comes about. Rebel Without a Cause, of course, one of my favorite movies to watch, is this rebel who's rebelling against this sort of, you know, contained, very consensus-oriented order, right? So the leftist critique is saying the liberals have killed true democracy and true radical possibilities because they're way too conservative, which I want to just point out for a second is the complete opposite definition of what the liberals are defined as on the right. And this sensibility, as happened on the right, then turns into this complaint that liberals not only are politically falling short, but they're very mockable. And they're so susceptible to try and do the right thing that they're going to bend over backwards to embrace radicalisms that don't affect their life, but make them look silly, look weak. So this brings us to the party that, or the meeting, depending on who you want to believe, at Leonard Bernstein's humongous, fancy Upper West Side apartment in New York City, where he brings out all of these luminaries, mostly white liberals, and has a meeting where the Black Panthers show up in their, you know, radical black leather with their giant afros, and they're roaming the halls. Some of them are armed. They're roaming the halls, and they're sort of bumping elbows with these super wealthy Upper West Side New Yorkers who are trying to be cool and trying to fit in and trying to, you know, show their true radical credentials by hanging out with the Black Panthers. And Tom Wolfe was a journalist at the time, and he stole an invitation to this party from a colleague of his who had been invited. He thieved the invitation and then went to the party and then wrote this blistering 20,000 word article that has magnificent descriptions of the party. Just fantastic stuff. There are even pictures that just, you can't help but laugh out loud and look at some of the radical incongruities between the sort of white, rich Upper East Side life and this sort of Black Panthers coming from the sort of urban areas of America. There's just like, how do these two parties meet? And to get to the substance of what your question is, the answer is that these white liberals are so weak and they're so looking for something to buy into and believe that they'll embrace things that are overly radical, overly revolutionary, because they're losing their toehold in American life. And they're just trying to be cool, trying to preserve power. And the phrase that Tom Wolfe attaches to it is radical chic. So it's so cool, it's so chic to be part of this radical order. And it just becomes this open mocking of the liberal order. They've gone not far enough to bring about true equality, and now they're just faking it. And that has sort of continued on to this day. You can see sort of Bernie Sanders arguing that the liberal centrists in the Democratic Party are not really truly believing in equality. They're going to say nice things about equality, but mostly they're going to support corporations just to enrich themselves. And what we need are more radical possibilities. So they're almost, sort of trying to undercut them through mocking them for being elites, for being snobs. The phrase NIMBY always comes up. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. So as long as, let's have open housing policies as long as Black people don't move into my neighborhood. So that's a critique from the left. And it still exists today.
Well, and I want to get back to the mockery component of that, and we'll probably wrap up with that kind of bringing us into today. But before we get there, I'd really like to talk about the civil rights critique, because I think that brings a whole other dimension to liberalism, because it brings, right now we're kind of talking about class, upper elite, wealthy people, but when you bring race into it, Martin Luther King famously says in a letter from Birmingham jail that the white moderate is more dangerous than the KKK member because they are seeming to be on your side, but just telling you to wait, slow down, you're going too fast. So could you talk about how the civil rights movement, and especially Black intellectuals and leaders in that movement, add to this idea of liberalism that really critiques both sides of the coin? It kind of combines the conservative and the liberal, and I think, to my mind, brings out the best kind of critique of what a liberal may actually be.
Yeah, this is chapter 4 of my book, and it centers on the critique of James Baldwin, but it brings in many other actors as well. Look, for 200 years in the entirety of American experiment, Black people and Black Americans, before there was an America, have always sort of had a cagey relationship with white moderates. There is this sort of understanding that white moderates are going to be the way that Black people can get rights, that Black people can get access to equality, but white moderates are not always going to sacrifice anything of their own in order to help us out, or they might for a time, but at any given moment, when we're never quite sure when, they're going to pull the rug out from underneath us and leave us flat on our ass. So there is this constant relationship that goes back to the Quakers having separate areas of worship for Black people back in the colonial era. So it's not a new critique. But there is this moment in the 1940s and 1950s and early 1960s when Black Americans look at all the language that pops up during World War II. So during World War II, who's the United States fighting? We're fighting Hitler. And what is Hitler famous for? Butchering 6 million Jews, for not being a tolerant person. So the United States goes to great pains to define itself as a tolerant place where Americans all is a calling card. This phrase that no matter what your story of origin is, if you buy into the idea of America, you are a part of this circle of the we. You are an American. It is this place where opportunity and access is available to all. We are not perfect, but we can make strides towards being perfect. And so using that language in the 1940s and 1950s, Black Americans push for and succeed in a lot of ways in gaining rights. It happens in the early 1950s, of course, the famous Brown v. Board of Education case, which legally ends racial segregation as not being separate but equal, right? It's separate is not equal by definition is what gets decided in 1954 in the Brown case. So Black people are very cautiously optimistic that white people, especially white moderates, are now going to be on their side. So they start pushing for rights, and we see the Great March on Washington in the summer of 1963. 250,000 Americans show up in this peaceful protest of music and singing and praise and camping and pushing for rights and for racial equality. And so in this moment, you get someone like James Baldwin, who sort of is very cautiously optimistic. And his best-selling book, of course, is called The Fire Next Time. And there's a huge plea at the end of the book where he says, if now in this moment, Black moderates and white liberals are ready to push forward and create our nation. What a great phrase, right? To make our nation, to create what it is that we stand for, then we will finally have some sense of equality. But if white liberals back off one more time, and this is the title of the book, we will have the fire next time. Right? And he publishes that book in January of 63. And by the end of 1963, he was so frustrated by white liberals continually saying, as Martin Luther King famously wrote, wait, slow down. You get people like Lorraine Hansberry, Gwendolyn Brooks, other civil rights activists who are so frustrated, and all they're trying to do is push white liberals to be a little more radical, or at least live up to their own individual creed. And by the end of the 1960s, most Black Americans, especially the politicized ones, Martin Luther King, foremost among them, sort of start turning against white liberals as being people who are going to always be your halfway friends. They're never going to push for true equality because it's going to mean they have to expend some cost. And so you get this critique today. I mean, Ibram X. Kendi is one of the best-selling authors today writing on these kinds of subjects. And his book is all about anti-racism. That's his phrase. Anti-racists and anti-racism is on the left of the spectrum. Open bigots are on the right of them. And in the middle are this group that he really hates and has special ire for, and they're called the assimilationists, because they want to sort of assimilate people halfway into the American project. They don't want to bring about true equality. So this argument that starts in the middle 1960s, with the likes of James Baldwin, as we talked about, Martin Luther King, Gwendolyn Brooks, all these people, carries forward all the way to today. And then, for the sake of my book, my book is called Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals. This is when the word white gets affixed to liberals. And now, I have a Google alert set. So every morning I get an email saying the phrase white liberal was used in all the following venues. And man, if you want to wake up in an ugly mood, you should get that, because everybody who's talking about white liberals on the internet hates white liberals.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think that brings us into today, because I think everybody using it as kind of a whipping boy or a sacrificial lamb or whatever you want to call it, we live in such a culture where both sides aren't trying to win debate anymore. They're not trying to have a dialogue. It's a meme war. It's an insult war. It's who can have the most attention for the most amount of time. And it's always geared at, well, for the most part, geared at making fun of white liberals. And I think a lot of white people have this resentment at the fact that is kind of where all the ire and attention kind of ends up going. So could you explain to us why both sides want to own the libs?
Well, owning the libs is mostly a right-wing term, but I agree with your premise of the question. And owning the libs was interesting. I got to do sort of a deep dive into the origins of these phrases. And of course, owning the libs doesn't refer to slavery and slave times, but it's a computing term where you outprogram somebody else. So you own them is where it comes from. And then it morphs in the 1990s and early 2000s into owning the libs, because that becomes the thing that you want to do. Everybody loves dunking on libs today, right? So I think, look, after those three lines of attack that I outlined, one from the right, one from the left, one from civil rights advocates, and the civil rights critique gets picked up on by women's rights advocates, gay rights advocates, Palestinian advocates, all these minoritized groups who are pushing, they think liberals are not going to go far enough and they're only going to be your halfway friend. So this becomes this sort of standard trope. One thing that happens that's important to recognize is that a lot of self-proclaiming liberals stop calling themselves liberals. This happens in the 1960s very quickly because nobody wants to be tagged with that sort of burdensome definition, which could mean from the right that you're overly bureaucratic or that you want to bring about communism, or it could mean from the left that you're too beholden to capitalism, or it could mean from civil rights advocates that you're too wishy-washy and milquetoast when it comes to pushing for real equality. So nobody wants to claim this thing because it's too impossible to defend, because you don't know who's attacking the word from what perspective. So starting in the 1960s, people stopped claiming to be a liberal. And that carries away all the way to today. There was another podcast where Bernie Sanders and Trevor Noah were talking, and Trevor Noah says, do you think the Democratic Party today in 2025 is the avenue to bring about liberal reform? And Bernie Sanders jumps on him and says, I don't like the word liberal. Liberal is not the word. I'm not going to claim that word. And that was exactly what Hillary Clinton said when she was running for president in 2007. So lots of people have disowned the phrase liberal, who might have once upon a time claimed the mantle of liberalism as a faith worth fighting for. So without any defenders, people have been able to heap on whatever definition they want to heap on. So one of the fantastic things about writing this book is now all my friends send me the memes that you were just referring to. So I get all these memes of, well, this is what liberals look like. This is what liberals do. I oil my guns with liberal tears. I get all sorts of anti-liberal stuff. And look, here's why. Especially on the right, but not exclusively on the right, but this you see this more on the right than on the left. It is more difficult to put together a set of policies that is going to embrace a broad definition of the conservative movement or the center-left movement or whatever we want to call it. So absent any sort of fixed set of policies that's going to bring together your movement, what is going to bring together your movement? It's opposition to an enemy. So let's create an enemy and say that we're opposed to the enemy. And then we can field test ideas. And if those ideas field test well with our voters, then we'll just ascribe them to the liberals, right? But if they don't do well, then we'll just drop them and we'll not pursue them as part of our thing. So, I mean, this is why Donald Trump to this day, just all he does is tweet about liberals, liberal this, liberal that. It's all name calling about liberals, because that's easier than putting forward a whole comprehensive plan for what American government should look like and what American government should do. That's why today people on the left are like, how are these people on the right supporting Donald Trump when what he's doing is actively pushing against the things that enable them to eat? SNAP benefits are gone, and Republicans are the ones who receive more SNAP benefits than Democrats. So how could Republicans support this? Well, because they have a common tribal enemy, and that is the liberals. Right? On the left, it's also true, but it's not quite as expansive, in part because Donald Trump has done such a good job bringing together the right that the enemy doesn't have to be liberals. It's now MAGA America and the threats to American democracy. So that's why I say it's heavier on the right than it is on the left, but it is still there on the left. My friends on the left talk about how liberalism is just going to buttress communism and socialism, buttress capitalism and not bring about true equality. So they actually hate the liberal order. And what we're seeing right now in live time, actually, which is kind of exciting, is right now the Democratic Party is sort of in civil war with each other. And sort of the center left is the liberal tradition. And you get centrists like Chuck Schumer, or maybe Hakeem Jeffries, people like that, who want to sort of buttress capitalism, embrace American technology and manufacturing, and sort of keep the system intact with some modifications. But on the left, you get the sort of more social democratic tradition, which is AOC, Bernie Sanders, Zohran Mamdani, who's running for mayor of New York City right now. And they're sort of battling it out, saying, we don't need to buttress capitalism in the way that we have in the past, but we actually need a ground up approach to push back against all the inequalities that have been exacerbated since the 2008 financial crisis. What we're seeing, because inequality is becoming so dramatic, is the Venn diagram of these two parties is overlapping so much that there is this space where the center left and the left can actually come together and foment an attack. It's going to be difficult to actually bring about, but I think that we're actually watching it in live time come about in this moment. And as a historian, as a student of the American past, I can say that we do have the most progressive policies get passed when the center left and the left come together and they put together some of their differences and push forward legislation. We saw it in the 1930s, we saw it in the 1960s. So we have these moments of progressive legislation being passed when the center left and the left actually find common ground. And I think we're actually witnessing in live time that happening right now. And so we'll see. I don't think they will be able to unify under the language of liberalism, which is what they did in the 1930s. I'm not entirely sure they'll be able to use liberalism again like they did in the 1960s when it was deemed sort of great society liberalism. I don't know what phrase will come about that will sort of describe this tribal identity in the way MAGA describes the other tribal identity. We're watching this happen right now. So I don't have the answers for that. But what I can say is that something will come about, and that phrase will be a catchstone for a whole new kind of politics on the left and center left.
Well, and thank you, because I think you kind of answered my last question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is, do you think the word liberal will ever fall out of the political discourse, or is it here to stay? And I think you kind of touched on it with your last comments there, but I'm still asking.
Well, no, it's a good question, and thank you for asking, because it allows me to elaborate a little bit more on something that I think is really interesting. I think liberal will still remain a part of our political language, but as a whipping post, as a thing that people can abuse in order to try and define their own group. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon, but I do think that, I mean, we're already at historic lows of the number of Americans who claim to be liberal, which is something below 20%. So I think, and every time Donald Trump says something, it jumps up because people want to oppose him, but then it goes back down again. So I don't know that it can be a formative unifying cry for a faction of politics in the United States. I do think that the principles of liberalism that FDR described in 1932, which is opposition to oligarchy, which is use of the federal government as a way to provide a sort of more egalitarian sense from which Americans can prosper, I do think liberalism in that vein will continue. But I don't know that too many Americans will claim the mantle of being a liberal because of all the baggage that has been heaped upon it.